I went to the desert to find stars, but I found something even brighter. Hi, I'm Owen, and this is the story of a night under the desert sky that changed everything. I've always been drawn to the stars. There's something about their quiet, steady glow that makes the chaos of the world feel smaller, more manageable. At 24, as an astronomy student in Portland, I'd spent countless nights gazing at the sky through my telescope, mapping constellations in my notebook, losing myself in the vastness of the universe. But after my dad passed away 2 years ago, the stars became more than a passion, they became my refuge. When the grief felt too heavy, when the silence of my apartment became unbearable, I'd look up at the night sky and feel a little less alone, like the stars were whispering that everything would be okay. That's why I decided to take a solo trip to the Oregon desert for a stargazing retreat. I needed to get away, to clear my head, to find some kind of peace. I packed my telescope, a sleeping bag, and a few essentials into my beat-up hatchback and drove out to a remote campsite I'd found online, a place known for its clear, unpolluted skies. The drive was long, the road stretching endlessly through rolling hills and pine forests, but as the landscape opened up into the flat, arid expanse of the desert, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The air was dry and cool, the horizon painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the dunes. I set up camp near a small cluster of rocks, pitching my tent and laying out a blanket on the sand. The campsite was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant call of a coyote. I was alone, or so I thought. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to emerge, I noticed a faint glow a few hundred yards away, the flicker of a campfire. Someone else was here. I felt a pang of disappointment. I'd come for solitude, not company, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the light, the sand crunching softly beneath my boots. That's when I saw him. He was sitting cross-legged by the fire, a notebook in his lap, a pen in his hand, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. He looked about 26, with curly brown hair that fell just above his shoulders, a scruffy beard, and warm brown eyes that caught the firelight like amber. He wore a faded flannel shirt and cargo pants, a backpack resting beside him, a water bottle tucked into the side pocket. He looked free, like someone who belonged in the wild, someone who carried stories in the lines of his face. "Hey there," I called softly, not wanting to startle him, my flashlight beam catching the edge of his campsite. He looked up, a smile spreading across his face, easy and genuine. "Hey. Didn't expect to see anyone else out here," he said, his voice warm, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place, maybe Midwestern. He set his notebook down and gestured to the fire. "Wanna join me? I've got plenty of space." I hesitated, my instinct to retreat back to my own camp warring with the pull of his easy demeanor. But there was something about him, something that made me want to stay. "Sure," I said, switching off my flashlight and sitting across from him, the fire crackling between us. "I'm Owen. Milo," he replied, his smile widening. "Nice to meet you, Owen. You here for the stars?" I nodded, glancing up at the sky, where the Milky Way was starting to stretch across the horizon like a river of light. "Yeah, I'm an astronomy student. I needed a break, I guess. What about you?" "I'm a traveler," he said, leaning back on his hands, his gaze following mine to the stars. "I go where the wind takes me, collecting stories along the way. I write them down, people I meet, places I see. The desert's been calling me for a while. There's something about the vastness out here, it makes you feel small, but in a good way, you know?" I did know. I'd felt that same smallness every time I looked at the stars, a reminder of how big the universe was, how my problems, my grief, my loneliness, were just a tiny part of it. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire casting flickering shadows across the sand, the stars growing brighter with every passing minute. I set up my telescope nearby, adjusting the lens to focus on Jupiter, its moons faint but visible against the dark sky. "Want to take a look?" I asked, gesturing to the telescope, a small smile tugging at my lips. Milo's eyes lit up, and he scrambled to his feet, brushing sand off his pants. "Hell yeah," he said, his enthusiasm infectious. He peered through the eyepiece, letting out a low whistle. "That's incredible. I've seen a lot of things in my travels, but Jupiter? That's a first." We took turns looking through the telescope, pointing out constellations to each other: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Big Dipper. Milo didn't know much about astronomy, but he was eager to learn, his questions thoughtful and genuine. He told me stories of his travels, hiking through the Andes, camping on the beaches of Thailand, watching the sunrise over the Grand Canyon. His voice was steady and warm, each story painted with vivid details that made me feel like I was there with him: the wind in my hair, the sun on my skin. At one point, we lay back on the blanket I'd brought, side by side, staring up at the sky. The stars were breathtaking, a canvas of light that seemed to stretch into infinity. I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of awe and something else, something heavier. "My dad used to take me stargazing," I said, my voice quiet, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "We'd drive out to this little spot near our house, just the two of us, and he'd tell me about the constellations. He said the stars were proof that there's always light, even in the darkest moments." After he passed, I couldn't look at the sky for a long time. It hurt too much. But now, I feel like he's up there, watching over me. Milo turned his head to look at me, his brown eyes soft with understanding. "I'm sorry, Owen," he said, his voice gentle, like a hand reaching out to steady me. "That sounds really hard. But I bet your dad would be glad to know you're out here, finding your way back to the stars. Maybe he is watching, maybe he's the brightest one up there tonight." I smiled, a small, shaky smile, my chest aching with a bittersweet warmth. "Maybe," I whispered, blinking back tears. I hadn't talked about my dad with anyone in a long time, but with Milo, it felt safe. He didn't push, didn't pry, just listened, his presence a quiet comfort that made the grief feel a little less heavy. We stayed like that for hours, talking and stargazing, the desert stretching out around us like a sea of shadows. Milo told me about his dreams: to write a book one day, to share the stories he'd collected with the world. I told him about mine: to finish my degree, to work at an observatory, to discover something new about the universe. There was an ease between us, a connection I hadn't expected to find in the middle of nowhere, under a sky full of stars. But as the night wore on, reality crept in. Milo was leaving in the morning, heading to another city, another adventure. I'd be going back to Portland, to my classes, my routine, my quiet life. This, whatever this was, felt so fleeting, like a shooting star you only catch for a moment before it disappears. "I wish we had more time," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my eyes fixed on the sky, afraid to look at him, afraid of what I might see in his expression. Milo reached over, his hand finding mine in the dark, his fingers warm against my skin. "Me too," he said, his voice soft but certain. "But sometimes the shortest moments are the ones that mean the most. This night, it's something I'll carry with me, Owen. You've reminded me what it's like to slow down, to really see the world, and the people in it." His words wrapped around me like a blanket, filling the hollow spaces in my heart with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I turned to look at him, his face so close to mine, his brown eyes reflecting the starlight. For a moment, I thought about kissing him, about closing the distance between us, but I held back, too afraid of what it might mean, of how much it would hurt to say goodbye. Instead, I squeezed his hand, a silent thank you, a quiet promise to hold on to this moment, to let it be enough. We stayed like that until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. When it was time to go, Milo scribbled his email on a scrap of paper, pressing it into my hand with a smile. "Keep looking at the stars, Owen," he said, his voice steady, his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name. "And if you're ever in New Mexico, look me up. I'd love to stargaze with you again." I smiled, my heart full, the paper warm in my palm. "I will," I said, meaning it. As I drove back to Portland, the desert fading in my rearview mirror, I felt different, lighter, braver, like I'd found a piece of myself I'd lost when my dad passed. The stars had brought me to Milo, and Milo had brought me back to myself. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again, but I knew I'd never forget that night in the desert, under a sky full of light, where I found something brighter than the stars. And that's the story of how a night under the desert sky changed everything. If you love this emotional gay story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Check out my Starry Night design on Redbubble to celebrate the magic of fleeting connections. Redbubble link. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next story.